Good afternoon, Mr. Prime Minister. Today we have gathered to present Canada's new Reconciliation Wampum Bill. This new Wampum Bill signifies a new era of relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, where the two nations can live in harmony. Woven into the Reconciliation Wampum Bill are 8 components which will serve as the guidelines through our new era of reconciliation. These will be explained and followed by addressing the two specific issues: education on Indigenous culture and the access to life-sustaining resources. These issues will be discussed with respect to their inherent problems and how they will be addressed moving forward. After which, I will provide our firm's overall conclusion on how the Reconciliation Wampum Belt serves to benefit Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. The use of a wampum belt to signify this new era of reconciliation was no accident. The wampum belt has long been used as a legally binding instrument between parties, with the details of the agreements woven into the symbols used within the wampum. In our case, there are 8 components of the wampum, which highlight the reconciliatory nature of this agreement. The white background, symbolizing purity, good minds, and peace, provides a proper backdrop to this agreement. The numbers 20 and 21 symbolize the year in which this agreement was made and a new chapter of Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations began. The tree of peace symbolizes both peace amongst nations and peace with our environment. The people around the tree symbolize Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples living in harmony around the tree, which supports all life. The larger people are adults here and symbolize the short-term issues which need to be addressed in this generation, where the smaller people symbolize children and the longer-term changes which need to be made. The children also symbolize this agreement spanning across generations. The 2 horizontal bands were borrowed from the Treaty of Niagara of 1764. They represent the chains binding the 2 nations in peace, trust, love, and friendship, as well as the 2 nations respecting each other's culture. The use of 3 symbols of peace, such as the white shells of the wampum backdrop, the tree of peace, and the 2 horizontal bands, represent peace being achieved on multiple fronts. This shows Canada's commitment to comprehensive peace between nations, not just in one area of life, in all areas of life. It is the opinion of my firm that this notion of comprehensive peace between nations is not possible without addressing 2 distinct issues stemming from colonialism that Indigenous peoples face. The first issue is the lack of education surrounding Indigenous culture, and the second is the poor access to life-sustaining resources in Indigenous communities. Our first main issue is the lack of education on Indigenous culture and is directed at non-Indigenous people as well as Indigenous people. While it is crucial that Indigenous peoples are educated on the culture to prevent its extinction, education of Indigenous culture is also essential to non-Indigenous peoples, as it paves the road for both the white man and the red man to move through life harmoniously. During the colonization of Canada, the government actively prevented the education of Indigenous culture. This was done to exert further control over Indigenous nations for 3 reasons. The first is to control how non-Indigenous people viewed Indigenous people through the use of racist stereotypes. We still see the lasting effects of this today, as Indigenous peoples are stereotyped as overly reliant on government aid, drunks, and generally unintelligent people. While none of these are true, these are different than the stereotypes during colonization. They serve the same purpose of subjugating these Indigenous peoples. This may not seem like a problem for non-Indigenous peoples, but the continuation of these racist stereotypes solidifies the marginalization of Indigenous peoples in Canadian society. Having an entire nation of people marginalized in society only serves to harm the rest of society, as those marginalized are not seen nor heard. The second reason to prevent education of Indigenous culture was to prevent any sort of organic cultural permeation between the 2 nations. Preventing cultural permeation has served to keep the dominant cultural majority in a position to abuse Indigenous peoples while still remaining inside that cultural majority's societal norms. Not only does it keep non-Indigenous people within the cultural majority, it serves to subject Indigenous peoples to unfamiliar practices such as the Western-based common law legal system. By encouraging cultural permeation through the use of education, Canadian law could recognize both Western-based common law as well as Indigenous legal orders providing a bilateral justice system. A bilateral justice system would allow for greater representation of Indigenous perspectives in law, ultimately including Indigenous culture in Canadian society. By preventing this cultural permeation of Indigenous and non-Indigenous cultures, it has prevented the two cultures from finding a way to live in harmony. The third reason to prevent education was to limit Indigenous sympathizers. By preventing non-Indigenous people from learning about Indigenous culture, it has robbed Indigenous peoples of many non-Indigenous allies, which would help bridge the divide between the two peoples. Providing education on indigeneity in Canada, the government would be flipping this colonial notion of cultural separatism to provide harmony instead of strife. Educating Indigenous peoples on their own culture would also provide enormous benefits to reconciliation in Canada. By providing Indigenous education, Indigenous culture will be solidified within Canada, limiting the risk of cultural extinction. Additionally, by providing an Indigenous education, it would inspire a new generation of Indigenous advocates, which would act as the foundation to the continuation of the Reconciliation Wampum Belt Guidelines. These three reasons as to which Indigenous education was avoided are important to help address how and where reconciliation efforts can be focused. By removing the racist stereotypes, the cultural separatism, and the anti-Indigenous advocacy through education, barriers such as racial prejudice are lowered, which allows for a more open-minded approach to living in harmony. Our second main issue is addressing the massive gap in access of life-sustaining resources between Indigenous reserves and the rest of Canada. In order to promote reconciliation regarding Indigenous peoples, the Canadian government must establish a high level of dedication towards providing greater, unrestricted access to resources and services within Indigenous communities. This is an essential step in improving the quality of life for Indigenous nations, while also reconciling for the colonial measures which placed Indigenous peoples on the reserves. Indigenous communities have experienced serious problems due to colonialization, such as substance abuse, trauma from residential schools, economic displacement, and vulnerabilities to non-Indigenous interference. Along with the serious problems Indigenous communities face, there's the additional burden of lacking governmental infrastructure within these communities that non-Indigenous communities are afforded. The idea that these deficiencies have been brought upon the communities by the members themselves is simply wrong and has been a tool of colonizers to keep Indigenous communities marginalized. It has been proposed that to stimulate the economy of reserves, industrial production and resource extraction be widely implemented within those reserves. Our firm has determined that it would not be in the best interest of reconciliation to widely implement these avenues of economic stimulus as they run directly contrary to Indigenous perspectives on environmental stewardship. The Canadian government must prioritize healthcare and other life-sustaining resources as the service standard between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples is frankly embarrassing. If Canada wishes to truly reconcile with Indigenous nations, these infrastructural improvements placing Indigenous communities on par with non-Indigenous communities must be made. To usher in a new era of reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, our firm has created the Reconciliation Wampum Belt to act as a new treaty between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian government. The Wampum Belt represents comprehensive peace between Indigenous and non-Indigenous nations, which is set to last across future generations and take a harmonious approach to reconciliation in Canada. However, before reconciliation can be achieved, the Canadian government must implement free Indigenous education, as well as a commitment to building new infrastructure in all Indigenous communities, making them as equals to non-Indigenous communities. If Canada can achieve the two enumerated issues and follow the guidelines put in place by the Reconciliation Wampum Belt, the entirety of Canadian society will stand to benefit. Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, for allowing our firm to assist with Canada in taking this next great step towards reconciliation with Indigenous nations.